What occurs to me more and more at the moment is I woke up. I freely admit I woke up in 2020 on account of the pandemic, which after a few weeks made no sense to me, and I started asking questions. And then by the time the Ukraine war began to unfold, it took me about 5 minutes of digging around online to realize that what we were being told was incomplete at best and lies at worst. And then, fast forward to this week where events unfolded in Syria, I was able to predict, even as they were happening, that we just weren't going to be told the full story, that we were going to be given something spun. Now, I know where I fit in the food chain. And I'm a regular person coming to perceive a different reality. And now I've also internalized the understanding that, since the 90s, US foreign policy has been to subvert 7 regimes, 7 countries around the world, with a view to furthering not US foreign policy really, but the desires and wants of Netanyahu's Zionist Israel. That someone like me knows about this, and that someone like me also talks openly now and hears about the Nakba in 1948 and the Deir Yassin massacre and the assassination of Count Bernadotte. If I am talking about these things, it seems to me that so much has unraveled so quickly. I've never known a time when US has been perceived less as the good guy, the good guy of the left, of the West Wing, and and the movies that I grew up watching. And also, I grew up believing that Israel was the good guy in the Middle East. I just vaguely accepted that as the truth. And that if someone like me, where I sit in the food chain, has realized all of this, so much is unraveling so quickly that if we've all been pawns in a big game, that they're going to have to find a new game to play, or to play the old game by different rules, because if I can see it, everyone can see it.
Yeah, those are really interesting points. First of all, it is interesting when articulating some of the key events as to why people lost faith and trust in the media. There are so many of them that I omitted 2 vital ones, the ones you just referenced, namely the COVID narrative that completely fell apart in so many different ways, as well as the story about Russia and Ukraine. And it's really interesting because the way in which the COVID narrative was shielded from challenge was pure censorship, one of the most systemic, brute acts of censorship imaginable. You had these group of scientists in the Lancet before they had any idea of what was going on, but were petrified that they would get blamed for the release of this virus, announce that they knew for certain that the origin of the virus was not a lab leak, that was misinformation, that was racism against their Chinese colleagues. Instead, that it was this zoonotic leap naturally occurring from non-human species to animals, and that anyone saying otherwise was engaged in destructive, harmful, and disinformation. That led to a full year of banning any dissent on Facebook and other major social media outlets about any discussion of whether the original story was true. And now we know most people recognize that it certainly was debatable and probably almost entirely untrue. Same thing with all the other parts about the efficacy of masks and school lockdowns and what vaccines could actually accomplish and couldn't accomplish. And then in the same way that you saw censorship as the main tactic used there, the same was true with the war in Ukraine. It amazes me to this day that it's not more discussed, that one of the very first things the EU did after the Russian invasion in February of 2022 was in March of 2022, they made it illegal for any platform to allow adults in the EU to hear Russian state media. So if you want to hear RT or Sputnik, not because you're a Russian sympathizer, just because you don't want to only hear from your government, you'd like to get the perspective of the other side of the war, which is generally a good thing to do, they made it illegal to do that. And for example, the platform where my show is on, Rumble, to this day is unavailable in France because France wrote them a letter saying our law requires you to remove RT and Sputnik from your platform. And if you don't, we're going to cut you off the IP level. And Rumble said, we're not going to take orders from foreign governments about what content we can make available to our adult users and not. So you see this extreme reliance on censorship because they understand that is the only way they can shield it. And it's increasingly becoming, I think, more and more difficult to maintain. And then what that leads to is that when something like what happened in Syria happens, and we're fed this narrative that, is a very emotionally effective narrative, just like the narrative in COVID and Ukraine, where, the reason so many people were willing to, get on board with the COVID narrative is because fear is a very powerful motivating factor. It's part of our instinct. It's part of how we just survive. So if we're hearing from government officials and scientific experts and epidemiologists that you can't go out of your house, that if you leave your house without a mask, if you don't socially distance, you're going to die, that is a very strong emotion that they have purposely triggered. When you're told that the Ukraine-Russia conflict is a war between bad guys, Hitler-like figures, Nazis who want to reconquer all of Eastern Europe and then Western Europe on the one hand, and innocent, poor Ukrainians on the other, and you're shown pictures of Ukrainian grandmothers crying. These are very effective. They, for good people, trigger real emotions. And the same with Syria now, where we're told, oh, look, Assad was an evil dictator, which he was. There are a lot of Syrians who are happy, which they are. And that's all designed to prevent us from asking the geopolitical questions of why our governments work so hard to make this happen, who really is now empowered, what the effects are going to be. But I think the more they overplay their hand, the more they continue to lose trust and faith. That is the most powerful result. If I could just give you one story that I thought was so interesting about what you said too, and for me this is so illustrative. In 2023, I would say in the few months in the wake of the October 7th attacks, there were a bunch of young people who either weren't born during 9/11 or who were way too young to remember it, who discovered the letter that Osama bin Laden wrote to the United States government, to the American people rather, in 2002, in which he was trying to explain to the American people why there was so much anti-American sentiment in the region. Because at the time when 9/11 happened, Americans rightly wanted to know, and I don't blame them, why do they hate us? Why would people hate us so much that they would come and want to kill as many of us in the worst possible way? And the government had to provide an answer. And the answer the government provided was, oh, they hate us for our freedoms. These are religious fanatics and extremists. They hate that we have a Congress, that we vote, that women are allowed to wear bikinis on the beach. And that's why they attacked us, for our freedom. And that's why we have to go kill them, because our freedom is at stake. Now, there were so many reasons why that was preposterous even back then. There are dozens of countries around the world with the same amount of freedom, if not more, that Al-Qaeda has no interest in attacking. But when that bin Laden letter was written and it detailed all the very accurate involvements and destruction that the United States and the UK and NATO has had in that region, imposing dictatorships on them, sanctions regimes, bombings, support for the Israelis, as a reason why there's anti-American sentiment in that region, it was kind of ignored. That letter didn't get much attention. And then suddenly a bunch of young people discovered it on TikTok as they were focused on the U.S. support for the Israeli war in Gaza. And they said, wait a minute, I never knew any of this. I never knew that our support for Israel was part of why people in the Middle East hate us so much. I never knew that we did a sanctions regime that killed 500,000 Iraqi children, or that we were occupying Saudi Arabia, or that we had been bombing their civilians for years and imposing dictators. And when that started to happen, when young people in the United States started to talk about that bin Laden letter, there was immediate pressure on first TikTok and then The Guardian, which was the only place where that letter had really existed in a mainstream way, to remove the letter. The Guardian removed this historic letter because too many people were talking about it. Yeah, and then TikTok got pressured because they're petrified of getting kicked out of the United States and elsewhere to ban any discussion of it. It's such an amazing, extraordinary event where you think you live in a country of free speech, and yet when young people start to research for themselves, start to read important historical documents, and it makes them think a little bit too critically, there's an attempt to crush it and smash it within 48 hours, and it's very successful, to the point where The Guardian, a newspaper, removes the letter from their website so those links no longer work and no longer can anyone read it. And I think that is the sort of thing that as they do it more and more, they're really kind of sowing their own destruction.
When we know now that the intention to remove Saddam Hussein predates 9/11, that it was policy that was set down in the late 1990s, and that regardless of whether it's been a Democrat or a Republican administration in the White House, the deep state, or whatever you want to call it, has been prosecuting that agenda all of that time since the last millennium. and the 7 countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, and so on and so on, have been knocked over one by one. Libya, chaos, and so that only Iran now remains of the 7. What chance, given that seemingly unstoppable force of regime change and determined regime change, what chance does Donald Trump have coming in January, even if he wanted to, of changing the direction of the great ship of state?
Yeah, it's a great question. I remember probably the first presidential campaign that I really had any kind of emotional investment in. I had just started writing about politics in 2004, primarily as in opposition to the war on terror and the civil liberties destruction. And Obama came along, unlike Hillary, and said, I'm a constitutional lawyer. I believe in the basic foundational freedoms that can't be sacrificed even in the war on terror. And I guess I kind of believed him. Maybe it was naive, but even looking back, he was a young, idealistic constitutional lawyer. Probably there was a part of him that did actually believe that. And then he wins and he gets to Washington. He has this huge popular army behind him. I mean, he brought in massive amounts of young voters, new voters, people who didn't believe in the political system before, who really wanted him to fulfill this promise of changing how Washington works for the interest of other people. The same motives, by the way, that drove a lot of people to Trump. And Obama gets into office. He starts to get briefings from guys with tons of medals on their chest. He gets shown the most sensitive secret documents and is convinced that all of these programs that he vowed to overturn suddenly are in fact extremely important, that if he tried to eliminate any of them, he would have blood on their hands. And within about 3 months, he sent his lawyers into court to defend the constitutionality and legality of the very programs he has spent the last 2 years campaigning to uproot, and ended up even expanding them further than what George Bush and Dick Cheney were able to do. And I think the lesson for that, at least for me, was, and this is something Dwight Eisenhower warned about. He was a 5-star general, the hero of World War II, spent 8 years as president in the 1950s in the Cold War. And when he left office in 1961, he had about 8 minutes or 12 minutes to give his farewell speech on network television. And the thing that he chose to warn Americans about was the growing power of what he called the military-industrial complex, this powerful, permanent faction in Washington that he said was operating outside of democratic accountability and becoming even more powerful than the president. That was before Vietnam, before 9/11, before it was a tiny fraction then of what it is actually now. And so I do think the first term of the Trump presidency, the biggest failure by far, was that he allowed all these people to embed in his administration who weren't there, despite their personal flattery of him, to advance his agenda, but to undermine it. He had just gotten to Washington, didn't have the discipline to figure it out, didn't have the know-how. People close to Trump swear, and they've told me this on my show, but elsewhere, that he's aware of that he's determined to make sure that doesn't happen, that that's their main priority. But I'm not convinced at all, frankly, that other than a few symbolic victories, Trump, no matter how committed he is to this, and that remains to be seen as well, let's assume the best of him, that he's really energized at the age of 78 to go in and radically change Washington and its prevailing dogma. I'm not convinced at all that he has anywhere near the power and the kind of organizational competence and strategic cunning necessary to even get close to accomplishing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best I feel in my newfound cynicism, that the best you can say is that if indeed people like Obama were well intentioned, partially or completely, I mean, by 2011, he was prosecuting the desire to topple the Assad regime in Syria, and that has remained. Presidents have come and gone, but that has been being prosecuted regardless of the flavour of the administration. So I'm cynical. I am cynical about the potential of any president to redirect the ship of state. But I wonder though as well, do you have, given what happened there with Joe Biden providing a presidential pardon for Hunter Biden, which is de facto pardoning himself, given that it was backdated to 2014 and involvement in Ukraine and Burisma and the coup and all of the rest of it. How much faith do you have in the very idea that we live under the rule of law when it was so blatantly demonstrated there in that instance that there's one law for them and one law for everyone else?
In 2011, I wrote a book entitled With Justice for Some, obviously playing on the part of the Pledge of Allegiance that ends with the phrase with liberty and justice for all, based on the idea that there's a two-tiered justice system in the United States. And it's not just that wealthy people get better lawyers and therefore better outcomes, which of course is true. It really was more focused on this idea. It was prompted by what happened, which was when Obama was running in 2008. One of the big questions was, you argue, and I certainly agreed, that the Bush and Cheney administration had committed a lot of serious crimes in the prosecution of the war on terror, things like torture, illegal warrantless spying on Americans, rendition sites and CIA black sites where people were taken beyond the reach of human rights organizations, kidnapping off the streets, rendering off the streets of Europe and sending people to Libya and to Egypt and Syria, our good friend Bashar al-Assad, to be interrogated and tortured, that these were all crimes, clear crimes, not just under international law, but domestic law as well. Shouldn't they be held accountable like anybody else? I actually wrote a book before that about why they should be. And Obama during the campaign said, we're very open to that. No one's above the law. I'm going to ask my attorney general. I'll see if there are crimes committed. And if there are, we're going to prosecute him like we would anybody else. And then about a month after Obama was elected, he announces a full-scale amnesty for everyone in the CIA and for everyone involved in the prior administration when it came to torture, based on the ground that we have too many problems as a country and we have to look forward and not backward, which never made any sense. Obviously, every prosecution of every crime necessarily involves looking backwards, since crimes can only by definition happen in the past. Nobody else gets the benefit of that ideal. You know, common criminals, violent criminals, poor people, powerless people. We look back all the time to the past to determine what they did to punish them. It was kind of a special carve out for people who are powerful. And you can actually trace this back to the crimes of Richard Nixon, when the country decided for whatever reason that even though a lot of his underlings went to jail, that it was better for the country if he didn't. We made the same judgment when the 2008 financial crisis happened and all these people on Wall Street who got so rich through all sorts of reckless, if not outright illegal speculation and financial fraud, ended up being the ones most protected while everybody else was left to suffer and have their homes foreclosed, and generational wealth lost to ordinary people that affects everyone throughout the world to this day. So I don't think anyone takes seriously the idea of the rule of law. And it's one of the reasons why I've been so jaded about the democratic narrative, the liberal narrative of the United States, that Trump presents some sort of unique threat to our way of life, that he is somebody who doesn't believe in the rule of law, that he's going to prosecute his political opponents and immunize those closest to him, because we just watched the Democrats prosecute their political enemies and Joe Biden turn around and immunize, as you say, not just himself, not just his son, but also himself for any potential wrongdoing Joe Biden might have done in those deals Hunter was pursuing in Ukraine and China in 2014 and 2015. And that's another thing, is I do think most people have come to understand that the law is for most people, but not for everybody. And each one of these institutions that is, leaking all kinds of faith and trust and legitimacy is contributing to this broader view that society itself is unsustainable, that it only exists to benefit the few and crush the rest. And that's a very dangerous state of affairs, to have a perception that widespread about institutional authority in general.
Which I think goes back to some of what was revealed by the slipping of the mask in the aftermath of that assassination of the United Healthcare boss. I think that was what you started to see all the way through to. We sort of got a glimpse of a potential disobedient future. But I wonder to what extent you think that at the moment, is it simply the case that in its dying hours, the Biden administration is determined to cause as much trouble and lay down as much ruination in advance for Donald Trump? Before the election in November, they might have been able to say that they were still continuing with the mandate of the election victory in 2020. Well, whatever you make of that election victory or not, but by now the election having the will of the American people is Trump, and that it's mendacious and egregious the way that, or it seems to be, that the Biden administration picks now to do certain things that just leave so much mess in front of the incoming administration. mean, have you ever seen anything like it? So much destruction being deliberately created in advance.
Yeah, so as you probably know, the term that Americans use for this transition period where a party in power loses, we have this 3-month or so interval between the election and then the inauguration of the new president. So you have this president who is either on his way out or who lost, whose party lost, and he's sort of there as a kind of caretaker. And the term for it is lame duck, because generally it's as the phrase suggests, an animal who's basically has broken legs, just kind of is there to float around and to paddle just enough to keep himself afloat, but can't really do anything, can't really go anywhere. Obviously, if there's an emergency situation, the country is attacked, we only have one president at a time, of course, then he would be expected to react. But otherwise, it's really a kind of maintenance of a status quo, particularly so if the party in power just lost a resounding defeat, were just rejected by the American people, as is the case for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris on the one hand versus Donald Trump on the other. I think the most egregious example is the war in Ukraine, where I don't think it's so much that the Biden administration is purposely trying to leave a mess for Donald Trump out of vengeance or a desire to see him fail. I think it's out of fanatical belief that, for whatever reasons, these kinds of Western elites believe above all else that the number one geostrategic goal is to weaken the Russians and to destroy the Russian ability to be an influential actor in the world. And Donald Trump has made clear for as long as he's been on the political scene, since 2015, that he doesn't see the Russians as this implacable enemy of the United States. It's an adversary. We have a lot of different interests, but we have a lot of common interests as well. That's why he got accused of being a Russian spy, because of his expressed desire to have good relations with the country that has the largest nuclear stockpile on the planet. And part of what he promised repeatedly during the campaign was to come in and end the war in Ukraine that is causing the United States not just hundreds of billions of dollars, but the real risk of escalation. And over what? Over the question of who rules various eastern provinces in eastern Ukraine, which has absolutely no effect on the lives of the American people. It's a very dangerous situation. Biden, or whoever is acting in his name, is engaged in a whole variety of acts that they have long refused to engage in, precisely because they knew how escalatory they were, including using ATACMS missiles that, as Putin has correctly observed, isn't just something you give to the Ukrainians and say good luck. It's something that only the United States or the British or NATO can actually operate in terms of their guidance and precision capabilities. The Ukrainians don't have that ability to use on their own. So it's actual active belligerence by the United States and by the UK in bombing Russia. And to do that as a new policy after you lose an election, when a president's coming in who ran on a campaign promise, obviously ratified by the American people, to end that war, not to keep it going, that is such a deliberate contempt for the will of the American people, for their interests, for what they believe, that it's almost hard to believe it's happening, especially given how dangerous this game is that they're playing.
One last question, Glenn, before I let you go. 6 of the 7 aforementioned states having been regime changed or one way or another knocked out of the game. Only Iran remains of the 7. Are you fearful of an inevitability about some kind of head-on clash with Iran, with or without the intentions of Donald Trump coming in January?
For sure. And just to underscore your point about these 7 countries, this is not just 7 countries that people have been whispering about. Netanyahu wrote a book in the mid-1990s saying that the way to transform the Middle East is to have the United States change the government of these 7 countries. It ended up in memos inside the Pentagon that after 9/11, General Wesley Clark said he was repeatedly shown and has talked about these memos. And as you say, there's 7 countries that the Israelis want the United States to overthrow the government of, and they've done so in every one of these countries, now with Syria being complete, other than Iran. And of course, the number one aim of Netanyahu and the Israeli government and a lot of his most ardent loyalists inside the United States government, of which there are many, is to provoke the United States into a conflict with Iran. You've heard so many times since October 7th, but even before that, people standing up and saying, we need to go bomb Iran, we need to take Iran out, we need to change their government. That is the golden goose for people who believe in this worldview of what the United States should be doing. And while I don't think Donald Trump is interested in a hot war with Iran, because I don't think he's interested in starting hot wars with anybody, and for 4 years when he was president, we didn't have that, even though he nullified the Iran deal. The reality is that this time he had a bigger vulnerability than when he ran in 2016. In 2016, he ran. I don't think he cared that much about winning. He wasn't really that dependent on big donors. In 2024, it was really a matter of life or death for him. The choices were win the election or go to prison. And I think he became more desperate and then more vulnerable. You had people like Mary Matelson and other hardcore pro-Israel, pro-Zionist interests seizing on that opportunity to say, we'll support you, but you have to surround yourself by and be completely loyal to the interest of the most fanatical pro-Israel elements in the country. And that's exactly who ended up running his campaign, shaping and forming everything he did, filling his campaign coffers. And I do worry a lot that those people, and we've seen them be empowered one after the next, and the choices for these top cabinet positions might be able to get their way despite what Donald Trump might want, because he's unfortunately not that difficult to manipulate. And even the whole leaking during the campaign that after his 2 assassination attempts, which obviously affected him the way it would anybody, trying to convince him that it was Iran that was trying to kill him, that they were somehow behind the assassination attempts. Obviously, that is already a kind of preemptive attempt to start convincing him that destroying the Iranians or in some way severely destabilizing and uprooting the government is the thing that he ought to be devoted to most.
I said at the top of this conversation, Glenn, that things seem to move so fast that I don't know which way to look when I get out of bed in the morning. Having listened to you, I must say I still remain as cautious about looking into the future. But as I expected and hoped, it's been so most excellent and insightful to listen to your worldview. So thank you, Glen Greenwald, and I'll hope we can pick this conversation up again sometime in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'll try and bring some more optimism and sunshine the next time, not make you as a crumb.
Fantastic. Thank you, Glenn.
All right. Have a good day.